It's very nice to come to this point at the end of a range of fascinating papers. And I think, this conference has really shown that understanding modernism in the home raises a significant and challenging range of research questions. Speakers over the past couple of days have tackled these from a range of disciplinary and methodological perspectives and have offered compelling analyses of material cultures, domestic technologies, space and affect, design history, architectural history, urban and rural modes of domesticity, as well as looking at the significance of home in a whole range of texts from the early years of the 20th century. My own theoretical and methodological approach is shaped by the disciplines of literary studies and cultural history, so at least part of my lecture this afternoon will be concerned with offering a reading of representations of the home within a novel written in 1920. But speaking at the very end of this conference, which I think has been just brilliantly curated by Matilda, Rachel and Brittany, so thank you for that. I'd like to take some time to revisit what I think is a problem of the home for theories and theorists of modernity, to talk about some recent historical work as well that might be helpful in thinking further about the economic, political and cultural discourses that shape our understandings of home. My overall sense is that the politics of home and of homelessness are particularly pressing for us all right now, and that working on the home in modernism can generate some broader research questions that will speak, I think, to how we think about the home in 2019. So this lecture will have 3 sections. The first, History and the Home, where I will discuss the critical challenges we face in developing an account of home as a site of production as well as consumption, and also as a potential space for forms of resistance. And I've been very struck across many of the papers I've heard how often that question about the potential for modes of resistance within the domestic has emerged. The second section, the modernist novel in home, A Melancholic Modernity, and I'm going to be offering a reading of the novel Open the Door. And again, I picked that because it struck me that it was asking some interesting questions, which I will hope to persuade you of later, but also the idea of opening the home, crossing the threshold, liminalities and boundaries has featured in lots of the fascinating papers I've been lucky enough to hear. So I hope it will, add to some of your work. I know this is a relatively little-known novel by Catherine Carswell, but I'm going to think particularly about its focus on its deployment of domestic spaces and its related production of a melancholic form of modernity. And actually, again, interestingly, I thought it was a bit, I'll say more about this later, but I thought it was kind of odd that I'd read myself into this situation of thinking that melancholy was the organising theoretical category. And then again, I found lots of you talking about the melancholic as part of your own presentation. So it probably isn't an aberration of mine, and there might be something a bit substantial that we'll come to. Now, I know with this novel, I don't know how many of you know it, and I will tell you more about it later, it's only one kind of critical engagement. I'm not suggesting that this is a novel that is kind of particularly uniquely and only about the home. And there are other kinds of theoretical framings, in relation to nationalism and the question of Scottish modernism, post-colonial studies, gender studies, all of which could frame this novel in different ways. But today I'm talking about the home. And then finally, in a rather brief section, I'm going to talk about the economics and politics of home, where I will discuss some recent historical work on the political and aesthetic issues that framed the increase in both the scale and the quality of social housing after 1919, reflecting on how homelessness can be represented as both a political and an ethical issue. So, history and the home. The rich engagement with home within modernist studies, of which this conference is an excellent example, is a relatively recent phenomenon. As I've argued in a series of articles over recent years, the cultural history of modernism was for many years dominated by a theoretical and critical emphasis on the public sphere, and specifically the urban public sphere. This was expressed, for example, in a proliferation of analysis from the 1970s to the beginning of the new millennium, drawing on the figure of the flaneur, or indeed the flaneuse, as the archetypal figure for and of modernity. The flaneur, across a massive literature I'm sure you're all very familiar with, was understood as expressing a new mode of subjectivity, understood as a constant dialectic between the heroic assertion of individual autonomy and the seductive but threatening immersion in the crowd. So that particular psychological kind of conflict was what shaped a lot of theorizations of the modern. Within this critical and theoretical moment of cultural analysis, I'm quoting from myself here, strolling through urban space, encountering its multiplicity, its threats, its desires, and its commodities, seemed to many the most powerful possible metaphor of modernity. From within that particular critical and discursive space, I have argued, the domestic interior, the home, risks being understood as insufficiently modern, or even as not fully historical. Another academic context in which the home came to be seen as not fully historical, or at least less expressive of the key forces driving the production and consumption of modern culture, can be found in the development of cultural studies as a space and a mode of inquiry from the mid-1960s at this very university. And it's sort of rather wonderful serendipity that we should be sharing this building with a bunch of colleagues who are here talking about the legacy of Stuart Hall and, you know, the bringing of archival material back to the University of Birmingham. So that's a nice fact about today. One key text underpinning the emerging theoretical and methodological space of cultural studies was Richard Hoggart's 1957 study, The Uses of Literacy, which famously begins by trying to answer the question, who are the working classes? In seeking to answer this question, Hogarth focused particularly on an analysis of the working class home, particularly its interiors. His aim in the uses of literacy was to analyse, quote, changes in working class culture during the last 30 or 40 years. Now, given when he was writing this, he's actually talking about the years between 1919 and 1956. So, again, exactly the period with which the majority of the papers in this conference have actually been concerned. In particular, as they are being encouraged by mass publications. Quite interesting, I think, the cover. Now, cover choices are not necessarily under his control, but the cover choice being an image looking inside a home with a television set, I think is quite important in terms of a kind of metaphor for his argument. He argued that the cultural changes that he's concerned with were both broadly negative in terms of the richness and integrity of working class life, and also, and I think this is important, primarily associated with the home. So that argument is really an argument about the use of the home and the conservatism of the home. Hogarth writes in a section of the book entitled There's No Place Like Home, that for working class communities, quote, a strong sense of the importance of home ensures that change is taken slowly. Indeed, this association of home with a kind of conservatism underpins Hogarth's overall argument, which sees working class culture as under threat from a newer mass art, with this threat being encountered most significantly and negotiated most passively within the home. Hogarth's book is an articulate narrative of the loss and degradation of a culture, which concludes finally with an account of the erosion of class identity and of individual political agency as follows. Even if substantial inner freedom were lost, the great new classless class would be unlikely to know it. Its members would still regard themselves as free and be told that they were free. So a fairly classic false consciousness there. Hogarth's anthropological evocation of the landscape of the working class home in the uses of literacy was to be highly influential for the development of cultural studies in the following decades. But the theoretical and political framing of its analysis, which led to an association between the working class home and a kind of political passivity or lack of agency, I would suggest drove later cultural historians and theorists towards focusing almost exclusively on the public sphere, particularly the urban public sphere, and thus to a repudiation of the potential of home as a site of radical imagination or radical practice. Thus, for example, the occasional papers series published by the Birmingham University Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, which was of course first directed by Hogarth in the early 70s, so these are from the 70s, you can tell by the 20p price tag, and that goes back a little bit. They drew much more from culture as experienced in public spaces than from cultural experiences within the home. Early occasional papers focused on the theoretical framings necessary to understand the relations between culture and power and to identify the possibility of political agency. So that's Stuart Hall's piece on the Grundrisse. There were, for example, occasional papers on key concepts of social stratification, on the Grundrisse. Case studies were focused on the politics of popular culture, with examples including skinheads, the style of the mods, reggae, rastas and rudies, football and hooliganism, and the meanings of mugging. All incredibly important studies, but I'm just saying they're all about that public space, and that's the model. These studies were concerned with the public sphere, in which it was argued that agency and oppression were primarily negotiated. Occasional papers that focused on home were very much more limited in number and in scope, though arguably, I think, of great significance for the development of cultural studies over the following decades. So the ones that were there, I think, have been very influential. They included Pam Taylor's research on early 20th century female domestic servants and Angela McRobbie's work on magazines aimed at adolescent female readers. The theoretical framing of this kind of work on the cultural experiences of home drew on theories of femininity and consumption, and was, I think, really distinct from the Gramscian framing that shaped the majority of the Centre's published work in the 70s. It thus appeared to have much less to say about how culture can enable resistant forms of subjectivity, build political resistance, or assert new forms of identity. It also associated the home firmly with cultural consumption, while more public forms of cultural engagement were read as productive of new forms and new meanings, and potentially as progressive and as embodying forms of resistance. So that idea of resistance through rituals is a really important kind of underpinning of that work. So, reflecting on those dominant framings within cultural studies and cultural history, the key challenges facing those of us who seek to develop cultural histories of the home are, I would suggest, threefold. They require us to articulate much more clearly the ways in which the home is, first, a site of production as well as of consumption. Secondly, a place where political agencies can be generated and sustained. And thirdly, a central part of histories that seek to map the development of forms of power and of resistance. My aim in the following two parts of this lecture is thus to explore the extent to which, firstly, literary representations of the home, and secondly, the political and aesthetic framing of policies can respond to these challenges. So I'm going to move on to the second section now. As Marjorie Palmer McCulloch notes in Scottish Modernism and its Context, 1918 to 1959, quote, "The work of both male and female Scottish writers of the early 20th century is still struggling to be recognised, both within and without Scotland, as having made a contribution to modernism." McCulloch makes the case that there are important early 20th century Scottish women writers who have been insufficiently visible in literary and cultural histories of modernism, with the result that present-day critics find themselves, quote, "surprised to discover how prominent many of the women were in their time as actors on the literary stage within and beyond Scotland." She mentions in this context Willa Muir, Nan Shepherd, Lorna Moon, and also Catherine Carswell, whose novel Open the Door of 1920, McCulloch talks about, kind of briefly actually, characterises as having a modern tone, largely because of its, quote, "emphasis on the lives of young women and their attempts to lead independent lives." It will be my contention for the next 20 minutes or so that in Open the Door, a key focus for the representation of young women's developing subjectivity, as well as of their attempts to lead independent lives, can be found in its explorations of the nature of the home, which is thus central to my reading of it as part of this argument. I am assuming, but I may be wrong, that Carswell and her novel will not be known to all of you. So a brief introduction, it will be brief, may be helpful. This is just the text there is a biography by Jan Pildich, which I recommend to you, particularly if you're interested in giving a little bit more substance around the networks in which she's involved, because I can only talk about that quite briefly right now. Carswell was a novelist, biographer and journalist, born in 1879 and closely associated with many other writers who were part of the early 20th century Scottish Renaissance. She was born into a middle-class household in Glasgow and studied English literature at the University of Glasgow and music at the Frankfurt Conservatoire. From around 1930, she developed a close friendship with D.H. Lawrence, in which both writers consulted each other regularly about their writing, as well as about their public and their domestic lives. Carswell went on to publish a biography of Lawrence in 1932 called The Savage Pilgrimage, which is often the only text that people have read by Carswell. So there it is. Okay, Open the Door. Open the Door was Carswell's first novel and was published in 1920. It particularly is concerned with the developing selfhood and agency of its central character, Joanna Bannerman. But it also offers a broader cultural and social history of late 19th and early 20th century Scotland through its representation of her extended family and her contemporaries, of the houses they inhabited, and also of the multiple colonial spaces that frame their lives and to which they very frequently escape. Now, I'm not going to talk about that in depth, but again, I would just say I've been interested how some of the conversations that I've heard and some of the papers I've heard have tried to think about the domestic and empire and how they might reflect each other in all sorts of ways in terms of the economy and the aesthetic and the exchange of objects. So I'm going to try and point out where I think that might be important in this novel. So what I want to do is to locate the ways in which home is used to figure key aspects of the fraught and often destructive forms of subjectivity that Joanna experiences, which I will argue are best captured through the category of melancholia. I also will aim to demonstrate through this reading the ways in which this particular example of modernist literary writing foregrounded home as a space for the production of economic agency, as a place in which relationships are constructed and sustained, but also as a resource for the building of a politics of resistance, however partial and negotiated that might be. Open the Door begins with a biblical quotation, 2 Kings, for those who want to know, which is, "Open the door and flee." So that's right at the top of the novel, which establishes from the outset its concerns with home and the possibility of freedom. Its opening sentences read as follows. For Julie Bannerman, to leave home was in any case a heavy undertaking. And this also evokes the psychological impacts of home, in this case for Joanna Bannerman's mother. The leaving referred to here, you might think, is a relatively modest one, involving a train journey from Glasgow to Edinburgh. But it culminates in the unexpected death of Julie's husband and her subsequent miscarriage. So the simple displacement, the heavy undertaking, does indeed prove to be really significant in narrative terms. It leaves Julie doubly bereaved and increasingly economically and emotionally dependent on others. The complex psychological impacts of home, as experienced within the historical parameters of a modernity that remodels global, national and familial relations. These impacts are explored in depth within the novel, which represents the subjective experience of modernity for women as profoundly marked, not just by mourning, because there are multiple social and individual losses across the novel, but also by melancholia. As Freud argued in 1917, melancholia can productively be distinguished from mourning. Both involve psychological reactions to the loss of a loved object, but melancholia is associated not just with the experience of a lost and loved object, but also with the experience of a damaged subjectivity. In mourning, it is the world that has become poor and empty. In melancholia, it is the ego itself. The central protagonist of Open the Door is marked by an extreme melancholia, which leaves her constantly vulnerable and at times paralysed by multiple experiences of loss, with a terror of her nomadic condition and her loss of home, quote, abandoned, waiting in a perfection of emptiness. Melancholia is represented in Open the Door as the inescapable psychological consequence of modern life for women, where traumatic losses generate a precarious ego, a vulnerable sense of self, and also an unremitting economic precarity. At the beginning of the novel, the Bannerman family inhabit, quote, a solid black house, deep bitten by the carbonic deposits of half a century in the West End of Glasgow. The house had a forsaken look, yet for the family, quote, the ugly, well-built house at the corner felt like a part of themselves. Those solid, this is only page 24 of a very long novel, right? Those solid and embedded selves are quickly fragmented as the action of the novel progresses and the losses multiply. For example, Julie Bannerman loses her close connection to the evangelical church that has been at the centre of her practical and emotional life, and thus becomes, quote, subject to fits of depression which no wrestlings of the spirit seemed to avert or allay. So that, quote, the household seemed dishevelled. Psychological and domestic dishevelment are here fundamentally intertwined. From such dishevelment and psychological fragmentation, the character of Joanna emerges initially as a young woman seeking actively to shape her creative and professional life. Her developing self-food is associated with a number of different domestic spaces, none of which, I guess a spoiler alert, is finally able to sustain the experience of agency she seeks. Her social milieu is the economically precarious middle classes of Glasgow in the early years of the 20th century. An early romantic encounter falls flat under the pressure of her lover's, quote, dread that he would never be able to earn a living, and his consequent decision to head to South Africa to work in the mining industry, the first of many, right? You can collect the colonial displacements. This loss and her father's earlier death are the most significant losses she has experienced at this stage of the novel, though there are many more to come. By this point, she has acquired an artist's studio, she is an artist, which was, quote, only a little drafty attic wedged under the slates of a high block of offices in town. But she decorates it with flowers, with strikingly modern examples of glassware, as she seeks to create this artistic room of her own. This is the scene of significant early experiences of sexual desire, also the space of confident assertions of subjective autonomy. But this particular attempt to achieve creative and social independence fails, and Joanna sinks into, quote, a kind of marasmus, a wasting without fever or apparent disease. She suffers, I would suggest, from a disabling form of melancholia. The family home is represented as both the cause and the expression of her dejection and her alienation. Quote, she lay there, staring at the ceiling. Oh, how familiar that ceiling was. There in the middle were the plugged up holes in the plaster, and there in one corner was a network of cracks like a map. Her family home is familiar, but it is also unfamiliar and fragile. Plugged up holes and networks of cracks are far from the solidity ascribed to the house, and thus to some extent to the Bannerman family, earlier in the novel. This oscillation, I think, contains something of the experience of the uncanny that Freud explored in 1919. I'm sure you are familiar with the argument, where he argued for the tendency of particular cultural objects and texts to reveal the strange within the ordinary, and thereby to generate extreme experiences of anxiety. Freud was alert to the semantic and the psychological complexity of the idea of the secret and private space and of its opposites. Heimlich is a word, the meaning of which develops in the direction of ambivalence until it finally coincides with its opposite, unheimlich. Joanna's uncanny experience of her home as both familiar and strange speaks to Freud's argument that, quote, this uncanny is in reality nothing new or alien, but something which is familiar and old established in the mind and which has become alienated from it only through the process of repression. This alienation through the process of repression haunts Joanna, driving her from home to home without ever offering her the security of a homeliness that is not marked by sometimes extreme experiences of anxiety. An invitation from an aunt who lives in Italy then opens, quote, an unsuspected door of escape. So another attempt to open the door from this moment of crisis and anxiety is, quote, the desire came upon her for liberated movement. This desire for liberated movement translates into the practical project of learning Italian, which is remarkably quickly followed by marriage to an Italian academic and inventor. The marriage fails and the husband dies. It's quite quick. These feel like the only possible narrative responses to his explicit statement that his aim was to imprison and control her. Quote, how would you like to live in a cage full of sunshine and beauty and delight, a cage of which the man you loved kept the key? Yes, Joanna's drugging of her own spirit in this catastrophic marriage places her inside a confined domestic space where she can neither open the door nor flee. I mean, she is briefly, kind of almost literally imprisoned, and from where she is rescued only through her husband's death. After a brief period staying in her aunt's home in Italy, Joanna returns to live in her mother's house in Glasgow and, quote, tasted despair. Almost 3 years now, she had been at home, and it had come to this. She had got no further than this in fulfilling her dream. Joanna seeks to overcome this despair through artistic practice and through the achievement of economic independence. Quote, her ambition was to earn her own living, someday to go to London. The first step towards Joanna's achievement of a productive artistic identity involves a friendship with a young woman called Euphemia Pringle, whose family are financially successful, hard-working, and they also seek pleasure and entertainment with energy and vigour, which is sharply contrasted by Joanna and by the novel with the depression, despondency, melancholia of the Bannermans. In the Pringles village in the south side of Glasgow, quote, there was constant noise of talk and laughter. All the rooms were left open and long conversations were carried on by people in different rooms on different floors. As the narrator of the novel concludes, quote, it would be difficult to find anything in greater contrast to the quiet, sad-coloured life at Collessie Street, which is where the Bannermans live, with its intense spiritual currents than this household. So there's a kind of obvious, geographical, aesthetic, kind of subjective contrast between different ways of inhabiting houses. Although actually, the vitality of that home, with its openness and its conversation and all, there's more going on than you think about, but I'll tell you that later. The next episode in Joanna's life involves an affair with an older married artist, Louis Pender, and a move to a room of her own in London. Quote, that independent life in London, which was her dream. As part of a tangled and self-destructive set of actions, she also briefly finds herself engaged to a man called Lawrence Uchart, of whom more later. But the name Lawrence is quite important, right? So she's in constant exchange with D.H. Lawrence, who's reading drafts of this novel and so on. So I think the name is not an accident. So she's found herself briefly engaged. She has to cope with the disappearance of her close friends. So now we're back to those jolly, gay, vivacious Pringles, right? Her close friend, Phemie Pringle, who travelled to New Zealand, another colonial, to escape the disgrace caused by her fiancé's fraud. Quote, Jimmy had been speculating with business money and borrowed money at that. So the economic underbelly of Scotland is here once more repressed through the narrative device of emigration to the colonies. So it's a kind of disgrace, secrecy, disaster, collapse. It all involves moving out of Glasgow towards empire. Various disgraces and disasters lead Joanna to a new understanding of her own character, and there's a kind of reflection on whether, you know, the good, the evil, the wicked, but I won't give you the detail of that. But the narrative insists that this insight into her personality was a vision, no less, and that moment of revelation coincides with Joanna and her mother finally moving out of the family home. So they've been in that big, solid room with the cracks and the holes and all that, right up to this point in the novel. And then, quote, Joanna went slowly from room to room of the empty house in a mute farewell. She had loved this house as well as hated it, but her spirit had already taken flight towards a riper phase of life. Without a pang, she took leave of the despoiled, sad walls. Joanna then arrives in London in the section of the novel that is preceded by another biblical epigraph, Behold, I make all things new. London and modernism, understood as a distinctive kind of aesthetic innovation as well as innovation in lifestyle and space, are mutually implicated for Joanna and for the novel. She stays briefly with her married sister in, quote, her beautiful hygienic home in the garden suburb. And her sister recommends to her that she take lodgings in the locally situated New Era boarding house, opened only a week ago. To follow, in other words, the route of the respectable working woman of modest means. But Joanna finds instead unfurnished rooms in Mayfair, quote, among one of the colonies of working people, which are a distinguishing feature of fashionable London. The rooms are small, but they include a bedroom and a studio. She considers them cheap. And the narrator insists that, quote, in Joanna's life, hitherto, no period had contained so prolonged a rapture of enjoyment as the 6 months that followed her entering into possession of the rooms above the archway. Primarily because, as the novel has it, of the physical fact of her own freedom. So there's a lot invested in modernity, urban, this room that is a room of her own, but also with a studio. Her time in London sees her love affair become increasingly fraught, not helped by the reappearance of Lawrence Ucher, remember him, to whom she had briefly been engaged. Both these relationships are intimately connected and also shaped by the space of her rented room. But her psychological state becomes increasingly fragile as she negotiates different forms of ambition and different forms of passion, arguing forcefully for the emotional centrality of autonomy and of agency. Quote, if your happiness is in the hands of other people or of any circumstances whatsoever, it is really only misery. Despite moments of nausea and distress, Joanna reflects that, quote, not before had she realised to the full the unhappiness of her teens. If she were at that moment half so unhappy, she would kill herself. So that's her reflection back on the distresses of her early life. Very soon after this insight, Joanna is faced by the loss of her mother, which generates both moments of vision, for example, the pulsing flight of some birds speeding inland, the giant stirring of the trees. They gave release to all that was cramped and tortured in her heart. But also moments of horror. Quote, the funeral and all connected with it was a progression of horrors. Her mother's death also brings financial disappointment, as her brother, there's a lot of this going on, her brother's speculative follies and consequent debts come to life, leaving the family impoverished and the brother heading off to a life in Australia. So we've covered South Africa, New Zealand and Australia so far. Yeah. Joanna's response to her bereavement, her intense experience of melancholia, undoes the precarious sense of autonomy and agency to which she had referred a little earlier in the novel, as she grapples with, quote, the dissolution which threatened her on her return to London, where she was beset on both sides by fear and, quote, survived from day to day, from week to week, by sheer stiffness of will. Here we seem to have moved from Freud's theory of melancholia towards Melanie Klein's argument in Mourning and its relation to manic depressive states, that melancholia drives a desperate search for something beyond subjective incompleteness and is characterized by paranoid insecurity. Such powerful evocation of what I am suggesting is a paranoid stiffness of will is certainly criticized within the novel, in the voice of Lawrence Uchart, echoing for sure, I think, his namesake. Lawrence Uchart says to Joanna, "It all goes to feed your egoism. You're all self-will. You work with all your strength for the very opposite of your nature's true desire." Right? So that autonomy, agency, desire to be separated becomes fed back to her as a pathological kind of self-will, which Lawrence Uchart asserts is against her true nature. We're getting to a point she's not going to get out of very easily. I think you've probably worked this out. This kind of critique of egoism and excessive will as, quote, opposite to true desire will bring the novel in its final section to an increasingly insistent sense of organicist metaphors, offering a form of integration and completeness, which has already, I think, been foreshadowed in the very beginning of the novel, because Joanna's father and indeed her brother are both named Sholto, which is a Scottish Gaelic name meaning the sower of seed. So she's the kind of progeny of somebody who embodies the organic. So that's where we've come back to. These metaphors intrude uncomfortably, proposing some kind of resolution of the novel's melancholic paralysis, but only at the price of Joanna's aspiration towards autonomy and individual agency. Abandoned by her lover, Louis Pender, Joanna slips into a kind of unconsciousness with, quote, a factitious access of spirits, rather light-headed. I may have forgotten to, no, I'm going to go, I'll come on to that. Rather light-headed, which comes to some people as one of the phases before collapse. So that she's got to that point of just before collapse. And she fears that, quote, fusion between flesh and spirit, in which alone is absolute being, had not taken place in her yet. And thus we come to the novel's conclusion, which is located in an imaginary space that is initially removed from the houses that have structured the novel up to this point, though invoking them through memory. The moment of epiphany in this section of the novel, that this section of the novel yields, is curiously pathetic. As Joanne lies awake in a hotel room, and I think it's important that it's a hotel room, it's not one of the many domestic spaces that she's inhabited. She lies awake in a hotel room in Edinburgh, listening to the sound of the water tank, which brings back overwhelming memories of the rural house where she spent her childhood holidays. Quote, on it went, sometimes singing, sometimes speaking, modulating continually from one delicate, undreamed of rhythm to another. For it was the voice before creation, secure, unearthly, frail as filigree, yet faithful as a star. This is a moment of preconscious rather than unconscious articulation of selfhood, secure, but also, quote, frail as filigree. And then when Joanna finally returns to the house that was the site of her childhood holidays, we're told that, quote, her absolved self had its birth. This absolved self is described as free of both the desire of sacrifice and the desire of pride. And thus, I think, as a resolution, we could say, of the mutually contradictory energies that were generated both by her melancholia and by her experience of the uncanniness of home. So a kind of narrative resolution, or thematic revolution, is achieved, but this organicist resolution does not does come at the price of any continuing representation of the historical forces with which the novel had been so preoccupied for its first 400 pages, or indeed of the distinctive quality of Joanna's experience of modernity that had so absorbed the novel from its beginning. So, having begun this analysis of Open the Door by seeking to read it as foregrounding home as a space of production, as offering an account of how historical identities are constructed and sustained, or offering insights into the possibilities of resistance, I have concluded, as to be fair, it concludes, with an imaginary resolution of abstracted forms of selfhood, and with a, quote, web of ripe seeds that has at this moment been scattered. So, how did we come to lose the potential of the home as a space and a place of lived historical identities within Open the Door? What is missing from this reading of the modernist home? And I think it's missing from Carswell as well as from me. It didn't end up where I wanted it to end up, but I did think I followed the logic of the narrative. So I think it's a kind of interesting place to land up. So one suggestion I would make at this point is that what critical encounters between modernism and the home can lack is a historical sense of the material circumstances that enable or constrain the generation of certain kinds of home. We know, I think all of us know, that modernist homes were decorated and styled in different ways. We understand the difference between a country house and a boarding house. But have we, as cultural and literary scholars, paid enough attention to the home as an economically and politically overdetermined space? Such issues have been key to recent work by social and cultural historians analysing the provision of social housing in the early years of the 20th century. Work that engages with the politics of public investment in homes, with the aesthetic questions that informed public policy in the early years of the 20th century, and also with the social impacts of poor housing and of homelessness. And these are the three I'm going to talk about. For Mark Swennerton, in Building the New Jerusalem, Architecture, Housing and Politics 1900-1930, for example, quote, the period 1900 to 1930 was the one in which the architecture, housing and politics of the modern world were formed. That's quite a strong claim, right, which we might, as a conference, want to embrace. In his account, the House and Town Planning Act of 1919 is, quote, the major turning point of the history of town planning in this country. The pressure to improve the deplorable housing conditions experienced by working class families before and during the First World War increased as the war came to its end. But increasing investment in social housing for working class families was also part of a broader movement involving activists, architects and planners that is being described by the social historian John Boughton as shaping and delivering municipal dreams, which is the title he takes. And I was very struck by the time I got to this. I've been through melancholia, two sorts of it, the uncanny, and now I've come on to dreams. So I seem to be finding it really hard to avoid Freud this afternoon, which is actually not always something I find so hard. So I don't know what we might want to say about that. But actually, I was thinking about who are the theoretical writers who are framing the work that's going on in this conference, and there's no very clear consensus about that, but Freud is definitely one of them. So you're not getting any Foucault, because he was another one, or even Lefebvre, but you've got some Freud, so there we are. Okay, so Bowden begins by discussing the Boundary Estate in East London, quote, Britain's first council estate opened in 1900. Seeing it as a political response to the evidence generated by a series of 19th century reformers, so Charles Booth, and Engels, the novelist Arthur Morrison. I mean, there are lots of testimonies in that late second half of the 19th century about the living conditions of the urban working classes. Urban working class homes are represented in these reports and in these fictions as sites of contagion and disease. So again, the motivations are about risk and about containment, as well as about some sense of entitlement or a right to have decent housing. And also, I suppose, relevant to this is the 1888 Local Government Act, which created both county councils and borough councils with the infrastructure and means to invest in new houses for the working poor. So there's a changed situation in a number of ways. The architectural and social vision that underpinned public investments in improved homes for working class families was shaped by Ruskin and Morris's writing, specifically, I guess, their critiques of the cheap and degraded architectural and physical environment of the modern city. It was further influenced by the Garden City movement, both in the UK and in Europe, more broadly, I guess. So Letchworth was established in 1903, Hampstead Garden Suburb in 1905. So again, we're looking at the early 20th century. And also by social activists such as Raymond Unwin, who co-authored The Art of Building a Home in 1901, which made the case for extreme simplicity in interiors, that they should be filled with, quote, such things as must come to hand, justified by their use. So there's a kind of, again, there's a kind of aesthetic that is underpinning this innovation. The case for greater public investment in housing had also been made during the war, when workers in key industries were accommodated at subsidised rates near to factories. The Ministry of Musicians provided hostel accommodation for over 20,000 workers between 1915 and 18, as well as building over 10,000 new permanent homes. But still, by 1918, with the return of several million men from the war, there was an acute housing shortage. A government commission of inquiry that had been set up in 1917 to investigate the causes of the significant industrial unrest across the UK identified the poor state of housing as a major cause, and in response the government committed to providing, quote, substantial financial assistance after the war. This generated a series of commissions and committees. I mean, it's easy to find all this material. There's an enormous amount, which, you know, is quite interesting reading. And the reports in 1918, 1919. Their recommendations included the provision of distinct forms of council housing in rural and urban spaces, the need for all homes to have a bath in a separate room, the importance of a well-designed kitchen. I know lots of you have been talking about kitchens. The need for good ventilation, effective and affordable heating, and running hot water. So those are the minimum standards of decent and acceptable levels of housing. The Tudor-Walters Committee, of which Raymond Unwin was a member, was also asked to consider questions of building construction in connection with provision of dwellings for the working classes. And its report has been described by Deborah Sugg Ryan in Ideal Homes as, quote, the first comprehensive treatise on public housing design that stressed quality as well as quantity. But the framing of these various committee reports in terms of entitlement and of universal decency did not survive the immediate aftermath of the war. Both financial institutions and the Treasury opposed the scale of the housing investment programmes proposed, and by 1920 public spending was being cut and the ambition associated with the provision of council housing diminished. Thus, in November 1920, which is actually the year in which Open the Door was published, so we can focus on that a little bit, the Cabinet Finance Committee, quote, agreed to a Treasury proposal for general cuts in public expenditure. This is resonating with the contemporary, right? Including the imposition of a definite limit on the local authority housing scheme. While the following year the Cabinet noted that now that the coal dispute was settled, there was not much danger of active unrest in Great Britain. As Deborah Sugg Ryan also notes, quote, many people continued to live in extremely poor slum conditions throughout the interwar period. And it's thus not surprising that when the social reformer Marjorie Spring Rice published the volume Working Class Wives, Their Health and Conditions in 1939, she showed that in relation to poverty and poor housing, quote, very little had changed. The materiality of the working class home, which was the subject of such intense scrutiny between 1917 and 1920, was increasingly overlooked through the rest of the 20s and 30s. And the case for universal provision of basic standards for all homes had effectively been lost. And these questions, I would suggest, remain a relatively neglected element of critical and theoretical encounters between modernism and the home up to this day. So just a coda. This Google Ngram, I know you probably can't read the scales, it charts the frequency of use of the word home in English from 1800 to 2008. I think it suggests that the modernist period was indeed one in which the home was of particular concern. You can see there up around 1920 to 1940, an increasing frequency of references to the home. But it also suggests that the political and cultural importance of home, judged by the frequency with which the word is invoked, has been increasing once more since the 1980s. So you can see at the end of that, it is tending upwards. It stops at 2008 because that's what the Google Ngrams do. But you might think it would carry on upwards at the end there. As Luke Sieber has argued, this also coincides with a tenfold increase in the frequency of use of the related word homeless over the past 30 years. For Sieber, it's important to understand the complex relationship between home and homeless as terms, and to understand the relatively recent historical emergence, he says 1960s, of the idea of homelessness as a defining category for individuals or for groups. Now, I absolutely get his argument, but nonetheless, I would suggest that our thinking about modernism in the home could and should be informed by a sense of what is at stake in politics, policies and practices in relation both to housing and to the meaning of homelessness. So I think we need to be a little bit more alert to how those are framed in the early years of the 20th century as well as of the 21st. We currently obviously have a housing market that's out of control, with a sort of meaning of affordability that is barely tenable, with devastating consequences to those who are seeking housing, who are seeking to make a home of their own. And I just wanted to finish by asking the question of what challenges paying attention to that set of questions might generate for the three methodological issues that have framed this lecture, which were the potential to configure the home as a site of production, the ability to think through the relations between home and effective forms of political agency, and finally, the possibility of building practices of resistance within the home. Thank you.